Welcome to City Church's On-Demand Messages. My name is Josh, and we're so glad that you're tuning in whenever and wherever you're tuning in from. In fact, it's possible that you either stumbled across this online or somebody shared this, and you are leading it maybe for the first time. If you have any questions or want to know more about who we are, we'd love for you to visit our website. In fact, if you can even plan your first visit on our website. If you've got kids, we have a kids ministry specifically for them. You can plan your visit. You can go ahead and check them in, learn more about what that will be like. Maybe a middle or high school student, we've got you covered. And so if you have any questions or anything that we can do for you, please just check out our website. Today's message is going to be very special, and we're thankful that you're tuning in. It'll be anywhere from 25 to 30 minutes. And so if we can do anything for you, please let us know. But enjoy today's message.
Over the last few weeks, we've been in a series called Transferring Trust. And in week one, Josh brought us into a space, and he said this, that when you trust God first, the provision will be enough. So when we trust God first, we know that the provision will be enough. And then last week, if you're here, we had some cakes on the stage, okay? If you're like, man, I miss cake. No, nobody actually got a piece of cake, but we had, which Josh, I'm a little upset about, but we had cakes on the stage, and Josh took us to a space to understand this. What does it look like to trust God first in your finances? So God gives us the cake. What does it look like to give him that first slice of cake? And then we move into today, and my question for you this morning is, what comes to mind when you think of the word consistent? So when you think of the word consistent, what comes to mind for you? Some of you think about the consistent knee pain that you're feeling right now because the weather's cold. All right, I'm there. All right, you're like, every morning you're like, man, this cold weather's got to go away. And you're walking down the hall like this, and people are like, are you okay? And you're like, yeah, it's the weather. You know, I'm with you. I'm that guy, that consistency. The other thing I think about when I think of the word consistent is my kids nagging, okay? All right, has anybody else been there before? Let's just be honest, right? Hey, can we do this? No, I'm sorry, we can't. Like, literally 10 seconds later, somehow they disappear, and then they show, hey, can we do this? And no, I just told you no. 20 seconds later, it's like they do this 10-second increment thing, and it's like, how are you so consistent, right? They are consistent. So I think about that consistency that they have, that they are just willing to pursue things that all frustrate. And so I'm like, yeah, you asked me that again, guess what? All right, and then the consistency changes, right? Because now it looks a little bit different. But I think about my kids and their consistency and their ability. It blows my mind. Because here's the thing, though, I think we need to understand about consistency. And Josh and Lauren alluded it to a little bit later with Reese's. I'm on board with that. I love a Reese's. Put that sucker in the freezer. Oh my gosh, that thing is good. Preach. Hey, we can preach on Reese's this morning, guys. No, I'm just kidding. Consistency, though, is easily distracted. Consistency is something that is easily distracted. Staying on one thing can be very difficult. So difficult that Jesus even talks about it. And he talks about, we're going to be in the book of Luke chapter 16 this morning. This is really where we're just going to stay for the most part. And so in Luke chapter 16 and verse 13, this is what we see. And this is a verse that if you've been in church, you've heard at some point. And maybe if you've never been to church, this is the verse that maybe church people use when they talk about money, because they're like, you can't serve money and God. And so this is the verse that maybe you've heard even if you haven't been in church. So in verse 13, Jesus is speaking, and he says, no one can serve two masters. For either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So as we look at this verse and we break this apart, we need to understand that Jesus is speaking, and he uses these words, these phrases in this passage to help us understand how consistency can be jaded a little bit, how it can be affected. And so he says, he will hate. So if we're choosing one thing we will hate. And that word just means to detest. So if we're looking at the two things, one of these things he's going to detest. So detest means that we will actually hate that thing. And so the other thing we see is we see the word love. So he will hate one, and we see the opposite, love. Now, so love in this specific passage actually can carry two meanings based on what it's talking about, right? Because we have God in this and we have money. So if it's a thing, so it's money, I'm content with it. So if I'm consistent with how I feel about money, I am content with it. If it's a person or if it's God, it's something I love dearly. And so here's how he's unfolding this passage when he thinks and he talks about serving God and money. And why are these two definitions here when we talk about things and person? It's because what I just said, we understand when he talks about this is you cannot serve God and money. So we have the person of God, we have God himself, and we have the thing, we have money. Why can't you do this? Why? Because if I choose one or the other, what's going to happen is I'm going to be devoted. In other words, I'm going to hold to one of those things. I'm going to hold to it tightly, and I'm going to despise the other thing. Which the word despise means to be content, which means if I hold to the other thing, okay, the other thing is not worth consideration. So if I hold to God and I see the goodness of who he is, the greatness of who it is, if I'm consistent with God, if I hold to him, then money I see in contempt. I will not even consider it because I know it's not worth consideration. The other side of that is if I am consistent in what finances is for me, it's the thing that I serve, I hold to, then when I get over here to God, he's not worth consideration. And so as Jesus presents this passage, he's talking about consistency. What I consistently serve reveals something about me. Consistency is always and will always be tried. So the question we have to ask as we see this verse, and this is, again, I think a verse that at some point maybe we've heard, we have to ask the question, why is this verse here? Why are we even talking about money? Some of you are here today for the first time. You're like, of course, I come to church today and they're talking about money. Of course. Some of you have been in church a long time and you're like, dadgummit, I should have skipped this Sunday. I just knew that we were going to talk about this. But why is this verse here and why are we talking about it? Here's one of the reasons why is because Jesus said this. This is from Jesus. And nearly 15% of everything Jesus spoke about was related to money and possessions. So he knew it was important because money is important. Why? Because our hearts are important. It's not the money, it's the heart that's important. And so as we look at this passage, this verse sits after one of the most surprising stories I think we find Jesus share. It's a story that honestly, as I dug into it, I was like, you know what? This is very different. And we need to know this about this story. We need to know our two groups of people that Jesus is speaking to in this story. And the two groups of people are this. In verse 1 of chapter 16, we find that he's talking to the disciples. So the disciples are those that Jesus called to follow him in his earthly ministry so that he could train them up to take and step over to continue to spread the name of Jesus. So these are Jews that Jesus called to be his disciples, to follow him. And then we have the Pharisees. And so these were the religious leaders who held tightly to the traditions that they had set in place, some that they had found from the Bible itself, but some that they added themselves. And they were already set in space before Jesus came, but they were the religious leaders. So these are the two audiences that we find as this story unfolds. As we see verse 13, right after verse 13 is verse 14, the Pharisees. And so these are the two people that we find. And so Jesus shares a parable with these two groups. A parable is a story that he would use to illustrate a point. Now, I think it's important that in order for us to unfold verse 13, that we have to read this whole parable. And so it's on the screen. You can follow along with me on the screen, or if you have a Bible app or Bible, whatever is easiest for you as we read verses 1 through 7. So Jesus, again, he's speaking. He shares this story to illustrate his point. And so listen close to what happens. In verse 1 through 7, he also said to the disciples, he is Jesus, there was a rich man who had a manager, and charges were brought to him, the rich man, that this man, his manager, was wasting his possessions. And he called him, and he said to him, what is this that I hear about you? Turn in the account of your management, for you can no longer be manager. And the manager said to himself, what shall I do? Since my master is taking the management away from me, I'm not strong enough to dig. And I'm ashamed to beg. I have decided what to do. And so the manager figures out, here's what I'm going to do. So that when I'm removed from management, I'm removed from my position, I'm fired, people may receive me into their houses. So summoning his master's debtors one by one, he said to the first, how much do you owe my master? And in verse 6, he said, 100 measures of oil. This guy owed 100 measures of oil. He said to him, take your bill and sit down and quickly write 50. Then he said to another, and how much do you owe? He said, 100 measures of wheat. He said to him, take your bill and write 80. So here's the synopsis of this story Jesus is sharing to illustrate a point. Here's what he's saying. A rich man has someone managing his money. And it's found out that this manager is not managing the money well. And so the rich man calls in the manager and says, hey, listen, this is what I've heard. You're fired. So what does the manager do? Oh, snap. What am I going to do? What does the future look like? What am I going to do now? What does he do? He goes to the people that owe his boss money, and he says, hey, you owe 100, actually change it to 50. You owe this much, no, actually reduce this amount. And so what happens is he is taking his bosses, the invoices that he had wrote before, and he is lowering the amount that is owed. So right, imagine that next month it's December. All right, does anybody know what's happening in December? Anybody at all? No? Okay, cool. All right. My guess is the Orlando Magic are going to have the best record in the Eastern Conference of the NBA. Anyways, that has nothing to do with this point right now. Sorry, guys. That's just a shot fired right there for somebody. Imagine this. Next month, right? Let's just be honest. Finances just can take some stress, right? As we try to live up to the things that are around us and those that are around us and the things that we see. But imagine your electric company comes to you next month and says, you know what? Cut your bill in half this month. How would you feel? You would be just ecstatic, and you'd be like, hey, if anybody wants to come over for dinner from the electric company, you can come hang out. Like, if this is what it looks like. And this is what this guy is doing. He is making a way and making a stance for himself. So, okay, Warren, why is this story surprising? Like when you said at the beginning that this story is a little bit different, it's a little bit surprising, right? Because here's the thing, Warren, I know what's coming. We've been in this series talking about transferring trust. We've talking about how we should manage God's monies well. He's already been fired. This guy's been fired. And now the next verse, he's about to get it. Because not only did he mismanage the first time, now he's technically cheating his boss. So I know it's coming. And I would say, yeah, you're probably right. But then remember, Jesus is telling the story, and in verse 8, this is what Jesus said. The master, which was the rich man, commended the dishonest manager for his shrewdness. What? Jesus, really? What in the world? I'll be honest with you, I read this parable the first time. I did this. What are you trying to illustrate? What are you trying to show us? Here's the thing. The word commended means to praise and approve. So the master, the rich man, actually praised and approved his manager for being shrewd about going to the people that owed him money and cutting it in half. I think one thing that's important to know as we look at this passage, in this time and era, the Jews were under Roman rule. And so the Romans would tax the Jews, right? They would tax the Jews, and they would overtax the Jews. So my thought is that maybe the disciples are on the edge of their seat and they're like, this guy got to be shrewd with finances. Maybe we can be shrewd with our taxes, like maybe we can make it a shrewdness that maybe that's where Jesus is going. And maybe some of you are like, oh, I hope that's where he's going because tax season's coming up. Hang with me because we're going to find out this is not where Jesus is going. Jesus commended the shrewdness of someone who had mismanaged someone else's money. So the rest of verse 8, the master commended the dishonest manager for shrewdness, for the sons of the world are more shrewd in dealing with their own generation than the sons of light. So what we need to understand about this passage is that the sons of this world, as Jesus makes this statement, he's referring to those that don't claim and know Jesus. So he's saying those that have no aim from God on how they should steward their money, how they should steward what they've been giving. They're more shrewd than those that are sons of the light. And those are those people that claim Jesus, that believe in God, that have direction from God on how to manage what they've been given. You see, what is commended in this passage is not the dishonesty of the manager, but the ingenuity. Because the manager moved from the now mindset to preparing for his future. He used his present position to impact his future. You see, the word that we see in this passage that's a little different is the word shrewd, which means that he became prudent and mindful of himself. of his own interest. As we look at this passage and we see the sons of the world and the sons of light, we have to understand that the sons of this world's interest is themselves. The sons of the light, those of us that claim Jesus, what is our interest? The interest of what God calls us to. And he says, look how much they are willing to invest and be concerned about their future. Because why did he go to all these people? What did it say? So that when he was completely removed, that he would have a house to go to. Because he could go to this guy and say, hey, remember that time I cut that debt in half for you? And he'd be like, yeah, I remember that. He's like, can I stay with you? He began to think about his future, right? And his shrewdness led him to that future stance. Jesus then takes all of this and he lumps it together and he makes a point in verse number 9. He says, and I tell you, make friends for yourselves by means of unrighteous wealth, so that when it fails, they may receive you into the eternal dwellings. What? You see, this is the manager did. He made friends so that his future would look different. Jesus takes this and illustrates it, saying that we need to use our present resources to impact eternity. Our interest is what interests God. As we trust God with what we have and manage it, it will impact more than today. It can impact eternity. So for this man, his generation, his future was just the amount of time that he was here on earth. For us, our generation, those of us that claim Jesus, our future is all of eternity. There is no end. Right? Scripture tells us that don't store up treasures here on earth because it'll rot, it'll rust, the moths will eat, it'll fade away. But store up eternal things that will last. But here's the thing. This kind of impact requires more than just a commitment. Right? The last couple of weeks we talked about, would you commit your trust to God and what he's given you? But it's more than just a one-time commitment. It's consistency. You see, Jesus makes it a little clearer, and he goes into verse 10 and 12, and he says, one who is faithful in very little is faithful in much. I remember the context of where we are. Those who are faithful in very little are faithful in much, and one who is dishonest in very little is also dishonest in much. If then you have not been faithful in the unrighteous wealth, who will entrust you the true riches? And if you've not been faithful in that which is another's, how will you give? Who will give you that which is your own? There's something that we have to connect to, because this leads us right into verse 13, which says in verse 13, no one can serve two masters, for either he will hate the one and love the other, or he will be devoted to the one and despise the other. You cannot serve God and money. So as we join this story together, we put this story together, as we join these verses together, we see that Jesus is moving us towards a greater understanding. You see, because in verse number 10, when it says the one who is faithful in little things actually is referring to money being the least important thing. That's difficult. How many of you paid a bill this week? Raise your hand. Okay. How many are you going to pay a bill next week? Okay. I know you definitely are going to pay. How many are going to pay a bill in 3 weeks? Some of you are like, I pay a bill every week because my truck sucks gas, and I am paying that sucker every week. It comes consistently. And so when you read something like this, when you read money's the least important thing, let's just be honest. That's hard, because it doesn't feel like that, right? It doesn't feel like money's the least important thing. You say, Warren, and I know that every person and situation is different in this room. I talked to someone last week who got an unexpected medical bill. How am I going to do this? I know that every person's story when it comes to finances is different. And so when you read this, I don't want to neglect the fact that when you hear money's the least important thing, it doesn't stir up in you a, Warren, are you kidding me? You see, but Jesus is moving us to something different. He's not saying that money is not important, right? That we don't need it to pay our bills. But money is just the evidence. It's not the foundation. It's how we use the least important, the very little. You see, the consistency of what we do with money reveals our commitment. How we consistently use it, it reveals our commitment. The consistency of how we use it. Let's be honest with you guys, or let me be honest with you guys. I like waffle fries from Chick-fil-A. They're so good, especially with Chick-fil-A sauce. I'm really killing you guys because they're closed on Sundays, because some of you are like, I'm going today. No, you're not. They're not open on Sunday. You know, I know this maybe sounds fickle, but as I studied this, I know that I am willing to consistently go out of my way for waffle fries. And it does reveal a little bit about my commitment. It does. I'm not going to tell you how many times I stop a week to get waffle fries, but it can add up quick. And it shares a story about my commitment, you know. And there's nothing wrong with, definitely nothing wrong with Chick-fil-A. But when the resources God has entrusted me with can make a different impact than some extra calories for me, I need to change my consistency to mirror what I say I'm committed to. Because see, remember, we have two audiences in this story. We have the disciples who Jesus is raising up, but there's another. We have the Pharisees. And so Jesus finishes this story. He says in verse 13, you can't serve God and money. And then guess how the Pharisees respond in verse 14. Here's what they say in verse 14. The Pharisees, who were lovers of money, they heard all these things and they ridiculed Jesus. They hear the story and they're like, okay, yeah, right. Why ridicule Jesus? Because Jesus had revealed their hearts. He had revealed what they were truly consistent in. Their commitment says one thing, but their consistency shows another. Their worth is in what they are worth. Their investment was what they could get today. And Jesus responds in verse 15, and Jesus says, and he said to them, you are those who justify yourselves before men. In other words, you proclaim that you are good and great. You're saying, this is what my commitment looks like. But God knows your hearts, for what is exalted among men is an abomination in the sight of God. In other words, the money that you claim is the best thing that gives you your worth. God says no. Jesus sees things differently because worth has nothing to do with what we are worth. Nothing. So let's go back to where we started. No one can serve God and money. There will be a challenge in our lives always of the consistency to choose one. But what we learn from this manager is the greatest robber of consistency is today. The greatest robber of consistency is now. Right? It's the same reason that you choose a Reese's right now, because it tastes good now. But if you consistently eat Reese's over a period of time, it affects the future. How is what you're doing now with what God has given you consistently affecting the future? What you choose today impacts tomorrow. For the shrewd manager, it was his own interest. He moved from, okay, I've got to do this today, to, oh no, I've got to think about the future now. For Jesus, it was choose me and watch as I take the least important things and use them for eternal impact. Because our greatest impact comes from the consistency of the future holder. I want to say this morning as I finish up. You say, Warren, I don't have much. You see, transferring trust is more than just finances. It's more than just money. Yes, in this passage we see this. But as we serve God, as our consistency moves to serve God, yes, it transfers and it moves our trust financially to God, but there's other things that God gives us. This past week, I have 4 boys, my wife and I, and our youngest is 8. And this past week, he comes to my wife and I, and he says, I want to get baptized. To Clifford, to Clay, to my own son Landon, to Brittany, to Candace, to Amory, to Hannah, to every City Kids city builder volunteer who has served in City Kids. Thank you. Thank you. Because your decision to be consistent and to serve God with what he's given you has now made eternal impact. You see, God is calling us to transfer trust of what he's given us, financially, our gifts, because everything that he takes and receives from us, he can do something greater that makes eternal impact.